Hey everybody, welcome back to another one. This time we'll be looking at the Islamic empires. That's one of the ways your book talks about them. It's a problematic term. Another term that's often used for these group of empires is the gunpowder empires. That's a problematic term. We'll get to what all this stuff means, but basically we've looked at Europe and the Atlantic world. We've looked a little bit at the Americas. We looked at what was going on in East Asia. Now we're going to look at sort of what's going on in Southwest Asia and India around the same time, leading into the modern period. So the first thing to know about these Islamic empires is just like we saw in China and Japan, they're largely controlled by themselves. They're largely self-managing. They have lots of connections to the rest of the world during the early modern period, but they're not like colonized by someone else or something like this. They're their own independent forces. They have a certain level of autonomy from the rest of societies around them. So they really are sort of unique and have their own sort of cultural and political developments going on that we can look at, again, that are going to sort of prep us for what happens kind of coming down the line a little bit. So first we'll look at the three sort of classic Islamic empires that are talked about during this time: the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, and the Mughal Empire, sort of stretching across Southwest Asia. Then we'll look at sort of the imperial Islamic world, what these empires were like, how they were similar, what it meant to be an Islamic empire, if that even is a thing. Then we'll finally kind of get to how these empires were in transition as we get closer and closer to the 1700s, 1800s. These empires are going to change. They're not static and stuck in the past somehow. We'll see that happening as well. So by the 1500s, we're going to see there's these groups of people, Turkish folks, that have spread out around Southwest Asia and Central Asia that are going to really transform the sort of Islamic world and create these regional empires. All of these empires we're going to look at in some way or another affiliate themselves with a sort of Turkish tradition, although as you'll see, they then tie it into their local beliefs, their local culture, their local peoples. So here's these three main empires I was speaking about a second ago: the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid, and the Mughal empires. Going from left to right, you have the purple expanse there. That's the Ottoman Empire. We've talked about them a little bit in a sense that Europeans were sort of trying to get around them, right? That's why they were going out around the Horn of Africa, right? The Safavid Empire is there in the sort of old Persian Empire. We'll look at that. The red there is the Mughal Empire, right? That's in India today and parts of Pakistan and Afghanistan. So the thing to know about these is they're all really multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-linguistic empires, but they're ruled by this small segment of society that's a sort of Turkish and Islamic elite. It's not always the case. It's a little bit tricky, especially because we're not quite sure who these Turkish people are. So here's a modern map of all the people that speak a Turkish language. Turkish folks were people that came out of Central Asia, kind of in this orange area here, right? The yellow's not showing up for you. Kind of in this area here. But these Turkish folks, they speak their own language. They're going to develop their own writing system. They're going to convert to Islam, and when they do, they're going to become much more popular in the Islamic world. They start as a sort of hired soldiers who are able to ride horses very well and very quickly and serve in the sort of upper echelons of the military. Then they sort of transfer that social clout over to being aristocratic, and they come to be seen as sort of a premier ethnicity within the Muslim world. So the first one we might look at here, the Ottoman Empire. The first thing to know about it is the incredible sort of length of time it existed. So you can see by the dates there, it goes from 1289 to 1923. after World War One. So the Ottoman Empire is going to be around for a really long time. Compared to the US, right, 1776 to today, much shorter period, or even if you're being generous, like 1600 or something like that. So it's a really long-lasting empire, and it was founded by Osman Bey. Bey just sort of means like chief or something like this, and the Ghazni. Ghazi is sort of a term that means sort of an Islamic warrior or Muslim warrior, but a lot of that comes sort of after the fact. Also, a lot of rulers take the term Ghazi as sort of title, right? And so it sort of loses a meaning in that sense. Anywho, we don't really know much about Osman Bey because there's not a lot of written documents from his time specifically about him. The first people to record his origin stories, it's more than 100 years after he's died, so some of that's pretty questionable. But according to these stories, he's the son of a sort of regional chief or a sort of local chief, and he comes up working with these other Islamic warriors and rebels against the Byzantine Empire, and is going to start sort of cleaving off big sections of this sort of failing Eastern Roman Empire. So the Ghazi and the early Ottomans develop a really efficient light cavalry. They're known as lots of Turkish warriors are for their horse riding skills, their speed in battle. They refined these skills, again, sort of from legend, in opposition to the Mongols or working for the Mongols. Anywho, over about 100 years, as you can kind of see on this map, there's this slow expansion out from that central area, eventually expanding all across big chunks of North Africa, all along the Red Sea, into Southwest Asia, and into what are now like the Balkans and up almost into Austria, getting really close to Vienna there near the top. In 1453, a really big event happens. They capture Constantinople. This is under Mehmed the Conqueror. Mehmed II, right? He's called the Conqueror by some, not by everybody. Anyway, there's just a massive period of expansion under Mehmed, and the idea of taking Constantinople is huge. It's been one of the biggest cities in Europe for hundreds of years. It's been the capital of Eastern Christianity for hundreds of years, and the Byzantine Empire had been this great, long-running empire, covering sort of all of Eastern Europe and around the Mediterranean. And now it's fallen to a sort of another empire, right, coming with the Ottomans. And as you can see, this really expands what the Ottomans have control over. The rulers of the Ottomans start to come to talk of themselves as rulers of two lands and two seas. And you can sort of see how they're connected north to the Black Sea and then down into the Mediterranean. But eventually they're going to connect through the Persian Gulf, through to the Red Sea, all these sorts of things as well, the Caspian Sea. So there's this big sort of connection. All of the parts that bind Europe to North Africa to Asia in this hub is where the Ottomans are going to develop and form this really long-lasting empire. One of the unique characteristics of the Ottoman Empire that people like to talk about because it really shaped their military capacity was the devshirme system and janissaries. So under this system, basically in the Ottoman Empire was ruled by a Muslim elite, but there were lots and lots of other religious groups. There was a large Christian minority, particularly in the Balkans and other parts around Southwest Asia. And these families were treated okay, but there was one interesting sort of thing that is almost like a form of tax or a part of being in the empire. The officials from the Ottoman Empire every few years would go out to towns and ask, specifically into communities that were Christian, and they would ask for all the young men, maybe between the age of like 10 to 18, to be brought to essentially like a marketplace or a public park or an open space where they could be examined. And each Christian family that had a male heir would sort of give them up to the state, or the state would take them, somewhat not so willingly perhaps. These boys were then dressed all in red, as you can see here, and taken back to the capital, where they were circumcised and converted to Islam and put into a sort of special training camp environment for the rest of their lives, where they trained to be soldiers that would be called janissaries. Some of these soldiers, as with anybody, wouldn't have been great soldiers, so they are going to end up getting jobs in the bureaucracy instead, the sort of wheels of the state, instead of actually serving in the military. But the boys that were talented in the sort of military arts would then be promoted through as officers or as these sort of special troops called janissaries, just meaning new troops. These troops were famous around the region in large part due to their incredible loyalty to the state and because they were known for adopting new technologies, in particular firearms and cannons. So the janissaries, being sort of taken from their homes and having been raised by the state, see the state as the sort of central foundation of their family or as their sort of identity. So it's natural that they would be sort of incredibly loyal to the state. Also training for years and years. This wasn't a volunteer army. This wasn't people that were pressed into the army. These were people that really knew what they were doing. They were professional soldiers and they were feared around the area. So why would you do this? Well, the idea is a couple-fold. One, you have obviously these crack troops that you can sort of send anywhere that are really loyal to the state, but it's also a way of managing the minorities within the empire, right? So you have a bunch of different groups, but the Muslim elites see this as a way to sort of tie these towns back into the Ottoman Empire overall. The people that are out in the Christian communities that are having their kids taken can still be proud of what their kids accomplish, right? Even though they're separate. So it's a sort of way of a heavy-handed way of incorporating those regions into the empire. Here are those Ottoman troops kind of grown up, these janissaries, and you can see they all have like long rifles and stuff like this. So that use of technology is going to be important. You're going to see it's a theme throughout these empires, this use of new firearm technology. That's why they're sometimes referred to as gunpowder empires. So one of the early leaders of the Ottoman Empire that you can see here is Suleiman the Magnificent. Whenever you see somebody named like the Magnificent or the Great or something like that, obviously you're going to wonder, well, what was so great about him, or what they do? Well, the first thing you might notice is he reigns for a really long time. So he was the ruler of the Ottoman Empire for almost 50 years. For a monarch, that's an incredibly long time. It means you're going to see big changes around the world. You're going to see big changes within your empire, and you have to respond to those over time. One of the things that he's very famous for is just expanding the Ottoman Empire. So under Suleiman Magnificent, you get all these new territories stretching down into North Africa, stretching into Europe, stretching into Southwest Asia, and the Ottoman state becomes much, much bigger. He also did a lot on the sort of bureaucratic side. He came up with an idea to sort of unify state law and Islamic law. If you know some stuff about this, you've probably heard of Islamic law. It comes up in the US pretty regularly, like Sharia law. But people don't normally know what they're talking about when they talk about it. Islamic law doesn't cover everything. It's not like the only law. In almost every way in Muslim countries, life is dictated by civil law. That is, law promulgated by the state or sort of promoted by the government. But there are certain areas of life, say like getting a divorce, that are covered by Islamic law. So what Solomon did that was really interesting was he took these sort of basic Islamic laws, he took the civil codes, and he tied them together. He made one sort of unified system out of that, so that you had a set of legal principles that covered both territories. It's a pretty cool way to do it. He also was a big believer in naval power. So remember, by 1520, when he comes to rule, you have Europeans that are trying to get around the Ottoman Empire, that are going around the Horn of Africa. The Portuguese, the Spanish are starting to explore the world, and there's new charts, there's new technologies. So the Ottomans are going to want in on that too, especially because, as we said, they're now the rulers of two lands and two seas, right? They're in Europe, they're in Asia, they're in the Black Sea, they're in the Mediterranean. So a big part of their empire is connected by this sort of oceanic travel or sea-based travel. And all this new naval technology really helps them get around the Mediterranean and tap into the Indian Ocean trade quite a bit more. Further than just trying to increase trade and land and legal coherence, he also is a huge patron of the arts, right? So here you have this great portrait of him. Why do rulers pay to have themselves painted and stuff? Part of it is just to feel good about themselves. Part of it is to support the arts. We're going to see that all of the leaders of the Islamic empires are really big patrons of the arts. And you do this for a few reasons. It makes you look cool, right? To have these sort of big paintings of you and people depicting you as magnificent. But it also makes you look more intelligent and like you care about other things than politics and military adventuring. If you sponsor the arts, it's a way of sort of improving society or showing your contribution to the state in other ways. Like you have this money, you could be spending it on who knows what, but you're doing it to create beautiful things that people can appreciate, right? So we're going to see all of these rulers are going to tap into that idea. So the next empire over is all in blue here, the Safavid Empire. This is the second one we'll be looking at. You can see the dates are a little bit shorter, right? 1501 to 1722. But still, that's more than 200 years, right? So that's pretty good in terms of like world empires for how long it lasts. Also, there was a long tradition in this area of different empires stretching back to the Persian Empire. And we'll see there's actually more stuff going on in the future after 1722. It's just not quite the same. So the Safavid Empire was founded by Ismail. Unlike Osman Bey, we know kind of a lot more about Ismail in his early life. It's a great story. It's really funky. Again, this is in the area that we would call Persia before. Now it's like parts of Eastern Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan. Anyway, Ismail has a crazy life story. I don't know why there's not like an American movie about him. I guess it's probably because he's a Muslim. But anywho, he's the son of a local, not tribal is the wrong word, but like a local leader who is both a sort of political military authority and a religious authority. But there's lots of contested rival powers in the region, and his father is killed by the sort of majority power that is more in line with Arab powers coming out of the Ottoman Empire or coming out of Mecca and the sort of more standard version of Islam. His father was a bit of an outsider. So when his father is killed and his older brother is killed, Ishmael is really young. He runs and is sort of protected by some of his father's followers. They take him out into the hills to hide out for a few years. When he turns 12, he leads his military and these followers back to like avenge his father's death. And they turn out to be great soldiers, and sort of one by one the dominoes fall until 1501 Ishmael captures Tabriz, which is a local sort of regional capital, and proclaims a new empire. So see, when he captures Tabriz there, he's maybe 14 or 15 years old. In this painting, they show him as like an older guy with a mustache and stuff, but actually he was really young at the time, right? He would have been like a teenager, right, when he was doing these sorts of things. When he founds the empire, he takes the title of Shah, which is just an old Persian term, like king or ruler, something like this. So Shah Ishmael proclaims this new Safavid empire, and it comes with a religion. The religion of the empire is going to be a form of Twelver Shiism as a sort of state religion. And the people that are his followers, that are this sort of mix of militant Islamic Twelvers, the sort of special splinter group, are called the Quizzlebash, which is a great word, right? It just means like redheads. And as you can see again in this painting, they're all depicted as having red head coverings. I'll tell you more about them in just a second. But this is a really sort of amazing story of the rise to power of this sort of younger kid who essentially leads a pretty radical sort of splinter group right to the top. So what is this sort of splinter group? Well, it's one version of a smaller version of Islam. It's called Twelver Islam. So the first thing you need to know is there's sort of differences between Sunni and Shia Muslims. If you've heard about these sorts of things before, this might be easier. If not, it's a little bit complicated, but it's not too bad. Sunni Muslims are the majority. Maybe 85 to 90% of Muslims around the world are Sunni. And Shia Muslims, or Shiite Islam, right, are the minority, right around 10% or so. And so what's the distinction? Well, way back after Muhammad's death, the sort of the original Muhammad, right, that founded Islam, there's not a clear succession. Who's going to take over next? And a split happens within the community. And some members of the community say, okay, Muhammad built this religion, he built this new empire. It should be led by a sort of political and religious authority, right? That sort of takes responsibility for the community. Shia practitioners, though, or people who are going to become Shia, say actually that's fine, but the person who's the leader should also be a descendant of Muhammad. Like there's something special in this person of Muhammad that will carry on through his lineage, and we need to make sure that lineage stays as an authority within the community. So the first split here happens around Ali, who's Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, and the Shia would like to see him as the leader, sort of promoting a lineage of religious leadership through the actual ancestry of Muhammad. But other Sunni, they don't agree. They think it should just be a political and religious authority, maybe elected by the community. So aside from that split, there is another sort of area of Islam, Sufis. Sufis are the mystics in Islam. So every religion has sort of outsider magical mystics, right? They embrace Islam as a personal religion. Islam doesn't necessarily have a church structure anyway, in the same way that many Christian churches do. But Sufis have an individual connection to the Prophet. They have an individual connection to God. There's a sort of intimacy between themselves and divine powers. They often write poetry. They often engage in esoteric or like secret, like mystic practices and arts. They dance. Sometimes they drink wine, which, if you know, for a lot of Muslims is sort of a taboo practice. But anyway, they're sort of just out there. So here you have like some dancing members of this community, this Sufi community, right, that are invoking sort of the religious power of God through movement. If you've ever seen like the whirling dervishes, like in Turkey or the Ottoman Empire, the people who like spin around and spin around and spin around as a way of like sort of connecting to God or something, that's another area of this. So the Twelvers are going to combine the Shia tradition with this sort of Sufi tradition, and they believe that there's like, the reason it's called Twelvers is there had been sort of 11, not prophets, but like main sort of people important to the religious tradition since Muhammad, and they thought there was a 12th one coming who would usher in a sort of apocalyptic new world in the same way that prophets had changed things, before. Of course, Muhammad in Islam is the last prophet, but these other Samadi and sort of powerful leaders would come and change the tradition. So a lot of the sort of more uh, traditional schools of Islam thought these guys were like wackos. So they're kind of on the outside of the main version of Islamic thought. This leads to some problems. When the Safavid Empire starts to come together, they're right on the border with the Ottoman Empire, right? They're touching up against each other. And some Ottoman subjects are drawn to this new form of Islam that combines sort of mystic teachings with a sort of minority tradition. So in 1511, some Ottoman subjects are starting to adopt these sort of 12 ideas, sort of adopt some of these Quizilbash policies and stuff, and the Ottomans don't like it. They see like a fringe group out on the edge of the empire that's doing something weird, so they send an army out to go kind of bring these people back into the fold, and their army gets beat up. They sent not enough people, not enough weapons. They thought it was just going to be like a local rebellion, but it turned out to be sort of more of a strong resistance. So the Ottomans kind of reflect on this for a little bit. They take a few years, and in 1514, they send a huge army with janissaries, with cannons, with all the new technology in firearms to go down and like really retake this area and make sure the Safavids are not in control of this land. So this time, the Safavids send their own forces, the Ottomans meet up in battle at a site Chaldiran, and the Ottomans just destroy the Safavids. They win big time. They have more soldiers, better soldiers, the best technology in the world in firearms at the time. So the Safavids just get really beat up, and they don't quite understand because they themselves, over the last 2 decades or so, have been really beating up on the other people around them because of their advanced technology and skills and stuff. So the Safavids go home a little bit sort of down on the whole situation, trying to understand how it could be. Had they lost sort of divine favor? Had they been, too hubristic or something in battle? Did they have the wrong technology or whatever? So they go home and try to reflect on this, and it causes a lot of changes in the early Safavid Empire. Specifically, one of the next Shahs, Shah Abbas the Great, again, right? If he's great, what's so great? You kind of need to think about that. Is going to make a lot of reforms to the Safavid Empire based on this loss and his sort of understanding of the changes that came afterwards. So again, you should look. He ruled from 1588 to 1629. That's a really long time, right? 40 years. And during this time, he oversees the expansion of the empire, radical reforms in the empire. He moves the capital to Isfahan. So he's going to really try to rebuild and try to make the empire as great as possible. And the way you do this is you modernize the military, right? You got beat up by the Ottoman military. They had soldiers who were, equipped with the latest technology, maybe better training. So you start doing that. He also noticed that the Ottomans make a lot of money off of trade, and maybe that's one of the reasons they're strong. So he wanted to increase trade, increase diplomacy to make them strong as well. And also, just like we saw with Solomon the Great, he's going to really begin to patronize the arts. He dumps a lot of money into sort of civic art projects, right? So like this painting of him here, he's in the center. You can tell it's him in the center because he's bigger than everybody else. But he encourages painting and all this new sort of fabric weaving and geometric designs, mosque building, all of these sorts of amazing artistic endeavors done under his reign. For one, it makes you look really cool and benevolent, but it also makes the whole empire look more involved in the sort of lives of the subjects, or creating beauty or creating grandeur, right? It lends a whole sense of authority to everything when you do stuff like this. So this really brings the Safavids into this sort of realm, the same level as the Ottomans in many ways. So the third of these Islamic empires we'll look at is the Mughal Empire. starting around the same time as the Safavid Empire, but it's further over to the east. It's the one that's kind of that reddish pink color, which is now like Pakistan and northern India. And you can see they run for about 330 years or something, right? So a really long running empire as well. The Mughal Empire is founded by this guy, Babur. He is from an area that today would be like Afghanistan, and he is he's like a low-ranking aristocrat. He's not a king or a prince or something like that, but he's not a common person. He's raised in this aristocratic family that has money, but not a lot of money. They have military prestige, but not a lot of prestige. So he wants more of these sorts of things, though, right? And the way you do this, he finds out, is it's really easy for him and some troops to go into northern India and raid places that have a lot of cash and take it back with him quickly. So the places that he tends to attack are like Hindu temples, Buddhist temples, because there's lots of gold and art and other things there that can increase his sort of prestige. So he frequently, him and his men frequently invade northern India and plunder some of these sorts of places. And he claims the right to do this in part because of his great lineage. Was he really the descendant of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane and stuff? Probably not, but it doesn't matter. He claimed to be. Here on the side I put Chinggis Khan, right? That's the more, that's just the more correct way of saying Genghis Khan, right? The Genghis Khan is sort of a weird English version. Chinggis Khan is normally how people say it elsewhere around the world. So one of these times that he's invading northern India, him and his men go further than regular, and in 1526 they get into Delhi, which is this big city in northern India that used to be the center of different empires. He attacks and plunders some sites. He expects more resistance, but there just really isn't any. So him and his men sort of just take over the capital, the old capital of previous empires. So all of a sudden, him and his men find themselves in Delhi, in control, but in control of what? They don't really know. So they proclaim essentially a new empire, but it's really loosely knit. It's connecting his home area in Afghanistan to northern India, to this old sort of capital in northern India that had territories in other places. And the term they use for this new empire is Mughal, which is just Mongol in Persian. But it was unclear what this empire would be about. It wasn't founded for a particular reason or through a particular military victory or by a particular lineage. It just sort of came to happen. So at first, though, it's not necessarily an Islamic empire. This guy wasn't doing these things for sort of the grandeur of Islam or something like this. He just happened to be Islamic. So the Mughal Empire really comes together over the next couple generations, particularly with Babur's son, Akbar. So Akbar is shown here riding this elephant. He now was born and raised in Delhi in this new empire that his family has created. It wasn't always assured that he would be the one to gain power. He had to sort of fight to be the ruler of this new empire that was forming, and there's a lot of stories about his sort of really violent rise to power. For example, in 1561, he had some beef with a general, Adam Khan. They get into an argument, and he throws this general out a window. He then walked down a flight of stairs, went and got the general, him and his guys, took him back up to the window, and he threw him out again to make sure like people saw it and the general was really dead. So there's these sorts of stories about him being violent and very forceful in his acquisition of the empire and how he's going to sort of make the Mughal Empire into a broader sort of state. He is violent in this regard, but in other ways, he's very subtle and very smart in the way that he brought other people in. So it's during this time that the sort of largely Hindu population of central and southern India is going to get absorbed into the Mughal Empire. These are people that would have been, again, in sort of separate previous large kingdoms, but they're going to get absorbed into the Mughal Empire. This new state that's forming is now covering much of India. Akbar was known to be illiterate. He couldn't read the Quran. He couldn't read any of his sort of local bureaucratic paperwork and stuff, but he was also considered very intelligent, and he recognized the value of reading. He would have people read to him all the time. So he would have people read the bureaucratic documents and statements and stuff coming in, and he used that information. He himself just never learned to read. And through all of this sort of contact with different people reading material to him, he came up with some really good ideas about how to control the empire. One of the things he found was there was a lot of tension out there between different ethnicities and sort of religious communities. And he promoted this idea that we should all kind of get along under the empire, that the empire would be a sort of blanket and everybody underneath it would be the same in a sort of sense. So even though there were a variety of different religious and ethnic communities under this Mughal empire that's forming, he says, you know what, that's okay. He was a Muslim, but he said, under this empire, we're going to have a sort of divine faith. As long as you're a believer, it's okay. It doesn't necessarily matter what you believe. And it's sort of, you're all kind of, maybe the Hindus are wrong about this, maybe the Buddhists are wrong about this, but it doesn't particularly matter. As long as you're a subject of the empire, faith is okay. So that was a new sort of turn. That was like a funky little twist. In some other areas we're going to see that are sort of Islamic states, there's often repression of other religious communities or one particular faith, right? So in the Safavid Empire, right, it's this sort of Shia faith. Under the Mughal Empire, because it's so diverse and so expansive, they can't really do that. They have to allow people to sort of function on their own level. So these Islamic empires are all going to form with this sort of Turkish elite or people who claim to be somehow Turkish. They're going to build these new administrative structures, new military institutions right on top of each other. But what does it really mean to be an Islamic empire? Is there a common thread, or is that all just kind of circumstantial, right? Well, there are some sort of commonalities that all of these empires are going to draw on. They're going to encourage the study of Islam and stuff for sure, but also they're so multi-ethnic and multi-lingual that they have to allow other stuff to come together. They have this Turkish inspiration, they have Mongol inspiration, they have Islamic inspiration, but they have to find a way to have that all work within these empires. So one of the first unifying factors amongst all these empires is that the leadership draw a lot of their authority from Islam, meaning the leaders proclaim religious power or religious monopoly in a sense. They try to connect themselves to Muhammad either through prayer or worship or through claiming direct lineage from Muhammad or his family. Also, they engage the church, right? There's not in Islam, again, one particular church structure like there is in the Catholic Church, but there is a community of the faithful that you can appeal to by doing things like sponsoring religious projects, building mosques, producing copies of the Quran, opening religious schools, all of these sorts of things. You can also have yourself depicted as imbued with sort of religious power, right? So you might depict yourself like here, surrounded by angels, right? Or you might depict yourself as having sort of mystic powers, like this guy riding this tiger, for example. It's pretty cool. But there's this connection. The leader has to be sort of connected to Islam in a certain way, even though the vast majority of people in the empire might not even be Muslim, since the ruling elite is, they certainly want that out of the leader. Another commonality that you see amongst all the leadership in these Islamic empires is a shared sense, this sort of vaguely Turkish identity. Well, what does that mean? It's really hard to define because remember, the Turkish people themselves are really diverse and kind of come from all over Central Asia. But there are some commonalities. There's a sort of legal system that comes out of Turkish society, the sort of Kanu system, these laws that are designed to be unifying in nature, meaning if you're part of a tribal society that's highly mobile, maybe even migratory, you design your laws to include more and more people because as you come across new people, you're going to include them in your group. So a lot of the sort of Turkish legal system is inclusive by nature or designed to pull people in towards one unified identity. Also, a part of the Turkish identity that remained from earlier times that coupled really well with the sort of Islamic appeal to authority was this belief that somehow secular leaders are just imbued with religious and spiritual authority. So the ruler is not only the civic leader or the leader of politics, but they should also be a sort of moral and ethical leader, sort of in touch with the divine in some way. Another aspect of Turkish society and identity that gets carried over into all of these empires is the idea that the empire should be run sort of by the family unit, really large, right, or the clan unit. So in all of these empires, it's not the son and the son and the son who rules. There's a wider sort of base, but if someone comes to power, they might put their cousin in charge of the treasury, and they might put their son in charge of this, and they might put their uncle's, daughter's brother in charge of this or whatever. Uncle's daughter's brother. Yeah. Anyway, so all of the sort of components of the state run through the family or through the sort of leading name. So this is okay. There's nothing wrong with it in particular, but it's not really based on merit. And as we know really well, sometimes these skills are not just passed down from generation to generation. So someone might be a great political leader, but their kids might not have any political ability to speak of. Or someone might be a great lawyer, but it doesn't mean their kid's going to be a great lawyer. So a lot of these mechanisms of the state were run by people who were put there just because of birth. But the problem is that might lead to the state not always having the best people in the positions of power. It also leads to succession problems. If you put people in charge based on them being part of your family, once you die, there might be a lot more sort of squabbling between people about who's going to come to power. And it's rather than moving directly through a lineage or by law through a certain set of traditions, there's a lot more competition for who's going to be in charge after the leader dies. So sort of another interesting thing to look at is the role of women in these empires. There's a sort of problem of theory versus reality in some of these senses. In a lot of ways, women would have been just as repressed in the Islamic empires as they were around Europe or Asia or the Americas. But at the elite level, at least, you see a lot of interesting stuff going on and some very powerful women. And this has a certain legacy from the Mongol Empire. The Mongols in Southwest Asia had converted to Islam, and a lot of them kind of gave some of their legacy to these things. And one of the legacies from them was the role women played within the state. And this goes all the way back to Genghis Khan or Chinggis Khan. His mom and his wife, Holam was his wife, and Borte was his wife, Holam was his mom. And they played oversized roles in the sort of early expansion of the empire and the sort of politicking of the Mongol groups and stuff like this. All of the important Mongol leaders that were out had wives that were important politically. Often they married women from other regions to sort of try to connect their political empires. And this remained a popular idea within the Ottoman Empire, the Safavids, the Mughals. They all embraced these sorts of things. So you can look at individuals like Hurrem Sultan, Roxlana. Here she is. She is the wife of Solomon the Magnificent. She is noticeably not Turkish. She's not Arab. She's not from Southwest Asia, right? She is from Europe. She marries into the sort of royal family, and she plays a really big role in the early sort of political success of the Ottoman Empire. She's particularly involved in international affairs and connecting the Ottoman Empire around the Mediterranean. A very powerful woman. I don't know what exactly she's holding there, if that's like a little, I don't know, it almost looks like a mongoose or something. Yeah, anyway, so she plays a big role in the Ottoman Empire. You might also look at Nur Jahan, which was the wife of Jahangir, which I'll show you in just a second. So she is marries into the leadership of the Mughal Empire, and then she is going to basically run the empire for more than a decade. Her husband is going to have some troubles and basically get sidelined. And so, like you see in some empires around the world, the queen or the sort of wife of the emperor is really going to run things for a while. So Nur Jahan is going to run the empire really for a while. So at least in the Mughal Empire, there was the possibility for these sorts of things to happen. Jahangir is kind of an interesting case. He was obsessed with sort of like religion and other things and didn't actually do the running of the empire. So at least at the elite level, women are capable of being powerful and representative within these states. What did it actually look like on the ground in the villages in these empires? Probably women did not play an important role in like small scale civic power and stuff like this. Of course, they play a large role within the family or on the farm and things like that, of course. And Islam is no more repressive at this time than Christianity or any other religion, for that matter. So it's really tricky. You do see elite, powerful women, even though maybe theoretically they weren't supposed to be there. Another thing that's really funky in these Islamic empires, or in these sort of three empires we looked at, is the sort of demographic changes. They're not all even. So there's less effect on the population other than the Mughal Empire than you see in Europe, or even than we saw in China or Japan. So if you look at this graph, it goes 1500s right to 1800s. You see the Mughal Empire, that's like India, is blowing up, right? So they're having these big influxes of food from the Columbian Exchange is really going to help increase demographics. But if you look at the Safavid Empire, right, that's the orange one, it stays pretty steady across. If you look at the Ottoman Empire, it does jump up initially, but then it kind of stays steady across. So you get less of that huge demographic boom. These places were already in the center of Afro-Eurasia. They already had really complex food and trading systems. So they had some stuff, but not necessarily a lot of demographic change from that. One thing, though, that you can point at is you start to see a lot more horses during this time, and part of the reason for that is you can feed them better. It turns out that corn from the Americas grows really well in lots of these places. That corn is not necessarily included in the local diet that much, but it is grown to then feed to horses. The more, nutritious and delicious food you have for the horses, the more horses you have. So you actually see an expansion in the sort of equestrian world of these empires. But there's also other sort of interesting things that happen around this time in terms of the Columbian Exchange. So coffee, right, is going to be from East Africa, West Africa. It's going to become, even though it was known in the Arab world and it was known in Southwest Asia, it's going to become more of a commodity during this time, as is tobacco. And tobacco was from the Americas. And there was this new question in the Ottoman world or in the Safavid world, was coffee, was tobacco okay with given sort of Islamic regulations? Um, were these things forbidden, haram, right? Were they not to be done? And eventually, it's decided that yeah, coffee and tobacco are totally fine. But for a couple hundred years, there's actually big debates about whether these things should be excluded from dietary practices based on the sort of teachings of the Quran, or if they would be okay. Another thing that you might want to kind of think about, so we've been using this term Islamic empires, but it's a little deceptive. None of these empires had a majority of their people as Islamic, except for the Safavids, but even there, there's a lot of problems because the ruling elite, their version of the religion doesn't necessarily match everybody else's. So in these empires, there's extreme religious and ethnic diversity, even amongst the ruling elite who claim to be Muslim. So all these empires had, as empires do, dozens of different ethnicities, languages, stuff like this floating around in them, right? Expansive states always have these sorts of things. So there's no particular way Islamic states dealt with this. It wasn't like a one-size-fits-all thing. The Ottomans, the Mughals, they all had to come up with their own ideas about how to deal with this just incredible amount of diversity within the empire. So one sort of thing that might happen is you might get a lot of syncretic religion or sort of blending of traditions. So here, for example, Jahangir is the fourth Mughal empire or emperor, and you see him meeting with different Europeans. You see him holding this religious book, right? He's got some features of Islam showing some features of Hinduism. He has a sun halo, right? There's all kinds of stuff going on here. He was seen as sort of experimenting with all kinds of different religious thoughts. So in some Islamic communities, you get a real blending of Islam and local traditions. In Afghanistan, for example, right, you would have had the fakir people and stuff like this that are like if you see them, you might think they were Hindu people, like they do all kinds of other things, but they're Muslims. Or you might get just like local tradition creeping into the sort of Islamic tradition. But this can cause some problems too, and you can get the sort of reverse of that, where you get sort of conservatism, where you get people that are like, ah, no, all these local ideas are creeping into my religion. I need to get rid of those local ideas and get to like the true religion. So another way that some of these states dealt with diversity is to sort of make it a problem. So there's a real mix. However, one of the ways that's pretty universally used to sort of address this issue is by keeping the elite all as Islamic folks. So local people that are Hindu or Buddhist or Christian or Jewish, or have tribal affiliations or local religions, aren't necessarily moved up into the top echelons of society. The people at the top are always going to be picked from the sort of Islamic elite they're sort of part of this Turkish and Islamic tradition. And so by doing that, you can say, okay, yeah, we can have diversity and everybody can just do their own thing, but if you're Hindu, you're never going to rise to the top, or if you're Christian, you're never going to rise to the top. And it's because in these empires, amongst the Islamic elite, that the sort of most trustworthy people were seen as Muslims, right? Vice versa. So these empires, though, even as we're looking at them, are in just a rapid state of transition leading into the sort of modern period and in the periods that we're going to kind of come to talk about over the next few weeks. Just like everywhere else around the world, these places are not static. They're not like left behind by modernity or something. They're going to be right in the mix. So the first thing that you start to see in the 1700s and such is a sort of deterioration of leadership in these empires. So the dynasties in many ways are on decline. There's a lot of issues over secession. So remember we talked about the sort of Turkish tradition. that there's lots of different family members and there's sort of competition for leadership. This happens in these empires as well at the most elite levels. So it's not like the emperor son, emperor son, emperor son sort of system. There's usually a wider sort of contested base of who's going to be in charge. And when the leader dies, there's a lot of sort of secession infighting. And that over time leads to sort of factionalism, right, within the aristocrats over who's going to be in charge of the empire, rather than a smooth sort of transition of power. Also, you start to get religious tensions within these empires. As we get kind of further and further along, closer to the modern period, it becomes less and less acceptable for religions to be sort of diverse or non-conforming to a sort of traditional standard. So we saw this a little bit with the witch hunting, right? Protestant revolutions are happening, and you have to kind of get rid of non-Christian elements. The same thing is sort of happening in Southwest Asia and in these Islamic empires. There's tensions that for a long time there have been these sort of other religious elements floating around, and at first that's good. That helps people convert to new religions. But after the religions are established, sometimes people come along who don't like those non-conforming practices and want to get rid of them. So there's one big movement, the Wahhabi movement, that's aimed at sort of making Islam a sort of purer faith, getting rid of these sort of local traditions in some ways, and it's highly militarized. Also, you see tensions between the various factions in the religion. So, for example, the Ottoman and the Safavid conflict that we looked at over sort of Sunni and Shia problems. It's actually about who's going to control the land and the people, but it gets depicted as, based on religious difference. Also, some of these empires just have bad luck. And going into the 1700s, 1800s, they're just going to have a couple bad leaders in a row. And sometimes if your society is sort of having issues and you have a couple of bad leaders in a row, you can run into really big problems. And as we're gonna sort of slowly come to see, these leadership had been sort of more and more separated from the people. So they weren't necessarily in touch with the common folk. And as these sort of new ideas are going to come from the Enlightenment about revolution and who the government should work for, some of these people are going to be pretty separate from the folks who want revolution or want more sort of government connection. Also, a lot of these empires, although they start out as gunpowder empires, for example, and take over based on their military might and their early embracing of cannons and guns when a lot of people hadn't done it yet, that's not going to last, and they're going to kind of fall into a trap. So they start to lose some economic superiority when Europeans can go travel around Africa and head to India or figure out there's this whole other continents. For a while, they're sort of the central trading hub of Afro-Eurasia. But once Europeans can get on ships and can go elsewhere, they don't have to go through the Ottoman Empire. They don't have to go through the old Silk Roads or these old trading networks. These empires are going to lose a lot of their sort of economic supremacy. When that happens, they do things like expand slower. It's harder to take over new places if you have less money. Also, there's a lot of sort of unproductive wars. The Ottomans and the Safavids fighting against each other, for example, it didn't really lead to any new land acquisition. It didn't really expand the strength of the empires. You have problems like the Janissaries rebelling, right? So in 1589, well, why do your crack troops rebel? Well, if you've been training, just like we saw with the samurai, right? They'd been like warrior, warrior, warrior for hundreds of years. The Janissary were trained to be like the best militaries in the world. But if they're not getting sent somewhere to fight, that can cause problems, right? Or if they're losing their funding, or if they are no longer seen as like the top dogs, this can lead them to rebel. The sort of big trap, though, the big thing that happens is once these empires become so militarily dominant, they sort of stop it. So they have guns, they have cannons, they take over their neighbors, but then their other neighbors are going to continue to increase their technology, particularly in Europe. And so if these empires had done that, it would be kind of a different story, these Islamic empires. But a lot of them are going to be like, well, we're on top, we're the best army in the world, we'll keep doing what we're doing, because obviously it's working. And that's great for a short time. But if you don't continue to adapt and change, and maybe bring on other new technology, you can fall behind. And that's what a lot of people argue happened. But that doesn't necessarily mean that these cultures were somehow stuck in a sort of conservative tradition. And in fact, we can see a lot of other examples. So when you look at the sort of leadership in all of these empires, they were Muslim trained elites with the sort of Turkish background, right? We've talked about. But you don't have a lot of diversity at the top. And sometimes if you don't have a lot of diversity at the top, it's easier to get comfortable where you are. Also, since you have these Muslim elites, and the way to get to be elite, you have to sort of prove your Muslim credentials. There's not a lot of wiggle room. If people say you're not a good Muslim, maybe you won't become a top leader, right? So you have to be careful not to embrace anything that's too kind of controversial. And some things do appear to be too controversial. For example, in 1579, in Istanbul, right, which was Constantinople, there's a large astronomical observatory built. Here's a cool painting of it. At the time, it's like the best in the world. It's really highly funded. There's all of these new ideas coming out of Europe, a lot of them based on old Islamic and Jewish texts. And so this is sort of an attempt by the Ottoman Empire to get back into that game, to sort of understand these new telescopes, new star charts, new ways of understanding how the universe works. But the problem is they're too good at it, and they start to make some discoveries. They start to recreate the same experiments that are being done in Europe, and it threatens traditional leadership in a certain way, just like people were threatened by Galileo in Italy. So only a year later, the observatory is destroyed. So it's really interesting because you see both this sort of desire to be way out ahead in terms of technology and the sort of conservative movement to pull that back. You can see the exact same thing with the printing press. So there had been a lot of Jewish folks from Spain experimenting with the printing press. They brought those things to Istanbul. A lot of Muslims, right, who get run out of Spain by the Spanish and the Portuguese, the sort of new kingdoms coming back in that we talked about before. They end up in the Ottoman Empire. They bring, other European ideas and printing technology. But printing is sort of, for a while, a taboo subject. It interferes with the traditional sort of scribal roles, and there's sort of a religious sort of prohibition against printing in Arabic or Turkish. And so at first, that's illegal. But in 1729, printing is legalized in the Ottoman Empire. It's really encouraged for a few years, but then it's seen as like spreading too many ideas and maybe too many challenges to the Ottoman leadership and the Muslim leadership. So within about 13 years, printing is outlawed. So then it's illegal for a while, but then like 40 years later, printing's legal again, and it's highly promoted because that's how you come up with new scientific ideas that might make your nation more powerful. And so there's these sort of ebbs and flows, just like other places around the world. It's not like Muslim countries were more culturally conservative or technologically conservative or something like this. That's just not the case. But you do see these sorts of back and forths in the same way that you did in Europe. It's just where it's going is a little bit different, and we'll kind of get to that in the future a little bit. So the important thing to remember is all of these Islamic empires were sort of thriving and expanding during the early modern period, the same as China and Japan, or the same as we saw in West Africa, right? So it's not that they're somehow falling behind Europe or left out of the modern world, at least not at this point. At this point, between 1500 and 1700, these empires are really thriving, really expanding, really sort of growing in power. Then you start to see some sort of problems coming to the surface that would have been problems on their own. They're sort of separate from other sort of outside influence. But during this time, you get all of these new sort of cool cultural developments happening in these regions, and you see a leadership that's based on sort of political stability and unity, sort of trying to create something in these regions. Remember, they're still in this mode of empire that will unify all the subjects. It's not a nation state, it's not based on the Enlightenment, it's sort of something else. So we're going to see that as the Atlantic revolutions start coming this next week, that this is sort of a different process than what's developing out of the more Western European direction, and it will have consequences for the region later on. So next time we'll start looking at the Atlantic revolutions, particularly in the United States and France. Then we'll continue that looking at Haiti and the sort of eventual trickle down of these revolutions through South America. So get started reading on the traditions and encounters. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Talk to you soon.